Knowledge for the people, them.
Unofficially, the first black boxer to hold a British title was Andrew Jephthah, who was originally from Cape Town in South Africa. Jephthah defeated Curly Watson for the British welterweight title on the Whitechapel Road, Mile End, London in 1907. Now, there's a grey area whether Jephthah is recognised as a British champion. Jephthah won the title in 1907. In 1911, a colour bar was introduced into British boxing,
where any fighter who wasn't born to white parents couldn't compete for a British title.
The colour bar was introduced when world heavyweight champion, the first black heavyweight champion, Jack Johnson, travelled from America to Britain to defend his title at the Earl's Court Exhibition Centre in London, 2nd of October 1911, against the British champion, Bombardier Billy Wells. The Home Secretary of that time, Winston Churchill, vetoed the bout. A lot of the British public wanted to see the fight, but the powers to be, the government, had other ideas. When Jack Johnson defeated Tommy Burns in Australia to win the heavyweight title, the cameras were cut off before Jack applied the finish and stopped Burns. Film footage was suppressed all around the world. After Johnson defeated James J. Jeffries in a title defense, the playing of any filmed footage of the fight was banned in South Africa. White police and British authorities had issues handling blacks in the West Indies. They didn't say a specific part of the West Indies, after news broke that Johnson defeated Jeffries. The vetoing of Johnson versus Wells was to set precedents against any black fighter fighting a white fighter. The imposition of the collar bar meant a number of black boxers were denied the opportunity to fight at the top level. Len Johnson from Manchester was reckoned to be the best middleweight in Europe in the 1920s, but was unable to prove this because of his colour. Johnson later became a political activist who joined the Communist Party and stood for election to Parliament. My research leads to some sources saying the colour bar, or the colour line, ended in 1932, but as you can see here, February the 21st, 1935, the authorities of Albert Hall, I have a suspicion that's not the Royal Albert Hall, but Albert Hall, London Fistic Hall, today drew the colour line against Obie Walker, American Negro heavyweight, and declined to let Jeff Dixon, the promoter, use the hall for a proposed match between Walker and George Cook on February the 28th. Walker has been fighting successfully in Paris. France was a lot more tolerant of black athletes and black entertainers in general. That's where Jack Johnson fled to when they trumped up the Mann Act charges on him in America. He fought Jim Johnson in Paris, defending his heavyweight title in 1913. But back to Obie the Bearcat Walker. He did fight George Cook in England 3 months later after they drew the colour line on him, and he took a 10-round decision over George Cook at the White City. Obie Bearcat Walker, very interesting. 97 wins, 64 knockouts, 18 losses, 7 draws. Never stopped, never flawed, and some accounts say he was never even hurt in none of his fights. The much avoided heavyweight contender of the 1930s. He was highly avoided in Europe. They say Max Schmeling avoided him, and they say he could have knocked out Schmeling, Joe Louis and Jim Braddock in one night within the space of 10 rounds. Probably a bit of an exaggeration, but you get the gist. He was a bad man.
I'm a bad man.
Larry Gaines, a Canadian who settled and fought in Britain, was the first black fighter to contest a British Empire title in 1931. His fight against Phil Scott for the heavyweight title was watched by over 35,000 at Welford Road in Leicester. Gaines held the Empire title until 1934, despite remaining in Britain for the most of the remainder of his life. He was never allowed to contest the British title. Gaines was also the unofficial coloured world heavyweight champion from 1928 till 1935. The British title is not the same as the British Empire title. The British Empire title is now known as the Commonwealth title. Blacks couldn't contest the British title. Larry Gaines, who was also the last coloured heavyweight champion, The narrative is when Joe Louis won the official heavyweight title by knocking out James J. Braddock, they disbanded with the coloured heavyweight title, and Larry Gaines was the last champion. That was 1937. However, the colour bar remained in Britain until 1948, and the first official black British champion is Dick Turpin, brother of Randolph Turpin. 1948, Dick Turpin defeats Vince Hawkins for the British middleweight title at Villa Park, Birmingham. 40,000 spectators were in attendance. Turpin wasn't just the first black boxing champion, but the first black athlete to win any title in any British sport. Randolph Turpin is the first black British world champion. He defeated the great Sugar Ray Robinson in Earl's Court in 1951. In front of 18,000 fans, it was one of the biggest upsets in boxing history, barring none. Massive upset. Massive. It's described here as the biggest ever upset in a British ring. The Second World War finished in 1945. Then you had the mass migration from the Caribbean to the United Kingdom. West Indians in search of a better life, and they helped rebuild the country. The first immigrant to win a British title from Jamaica was Bunny Sterling, who was actually the dad of a friend of mine, Alex Sterling, who was also a professional boxer. The first immigrant to win the British heavyweight title was another Jamaican, also named Bunny, but this was Bunny Johnson. He beat Danny McClendon for the British and Commonwealth titles in 1975, and he also defeated Tim Wood in 1977 for the British light heavyweight title. When Bunny Sterling beat Mark Rowe in 1970 for that British 160-pound title, the Sun newspaper, with their clumsy headlines and propaganda, they dubbed George Francis as the White Witch Doctor. George was a bare-knuckle fighter, got involved in crime and done a long bird, and was quite a tough guy. Bunny Sterling became British and European champion at 160. Bunny Johnson became British Commonwealth champion at heavy and British light heavyweight champion. George also trained John Conte, black Liverpudlian, who defeated Jorge Ahumada for the vacant WBC World Light Heavyweight title in 1974. He also trained Cornelius Boza Edwards, former WBC Super Featherweight champion. He also worked with John the Beast Mugabe, former WBC Light Middleweight champion. He took Frank Bruno to the world title in Bruno's fourth attempt. Bunny Sterling started his boxing career in the UK at the St Pancras Amateur Gym where George was the trainer. They later occupied a pub in Haverstock Hill, and the gym was located on top of the pub, which was set up for professional boxers. And George would get called a nigger lover and how he could have a gym full of so many monkeys. But George, he stuck with it, saw the talent, and it was a niche market, I guess. And if he persevered with it, he'd be successful. Bunny Sterling lived in Kentish Town, which was a real ghetto, a slum, full of Irish and blacks. Because at that time, there was no Irish, no blacks, no dogs. When Bunny Sterling challenged Mark Rowe for the vacant British title at 160 at Empire Pool, they said it was a crumbling dump back then. When he stopped Rowe in the fourth on cuts, Rowe, who was from Kent, which borders on South London, had a lot of fans in attendance. There were disgraceful scenes at ringside that night. Sterling was not meant to beat their idol. Sterling had won just 16 of his 27 fights when he entered the ring. Now that's not because he couldn't fight. He had to take a lot of short notice fights and close decisions that went the other way, and some that weren't so close that he just was never going to get. So a lot of them black fighters from that time period, when you look at their records, can be a little deceptive. It says here Sterling had become a very good fighter in adversity. In fights he had no chance of winning, but he went on to become British, European and Commonwealth champion. And he's got some good scalps on his record too. He boxed abroad, Canada, 3 fights in Australia, Jamaica, Italy. It's not like Sterling had a choice of who he wanted to fight, even though he was champion. And a lot of the offers for him to take fights with the money on offer would be literally unacceptable. He had to hit the road and take alternative fights. It's a lot different for black fighters today. So eventually there was a rematch with Mark Rowe in 1973, and Bunny won that as well, over 15 rounds, and he retained his British title. Sterling eventually lost his British title to Kevin Finnegan, brother of Chris Finnegan, the Finnegan brothers, and he was paid just £1,500 when other British boxers were getting as much as 20 grand for title fights. He also defeated future world light middleweight champion Maurice Hope from Antigua, stopped him in 8. That win made him a 2-time British middleweight champion. Maurice Hope became the first black immigrant boxer to win a world title. He came from Antigua. He was a product of the Royal Oak Gym in Canning Town, run by Terry Lawless, and basically they trained the cartel promoted fighters such as Frank Bruno, Horace Notice, Gary Mason, John H. Stracey, Mark Kaler, Lloyd Hunnigan, Charlie Magri, Jim Watt, amongst others. The cartel was Mickey Duff, Jarvis Astaire, Mike Barrett. Just like the Haverstock Gym where George Francis was, the Royal Oak Gym was a pub, and the gym was located on top of the pub. For some reason, pubs and boxing gyms used to go together in London. 4th of March 1979, Maurice Hope defeated Rocky Matoli for the WBC light middleweight title, defeating the reigning champion via 9th round technical knockout. Maurice was a good puncher, 30 wins, 24 inside the distance, 4 losses, 1 draw. And we will follow up with a second part, tackling the 80s and 90s, but we had to start here with the colour line. We did that. Peace.